A father's search for his missing daughter leads to chilling discoveries in the shadows of his once familiar world. How far would you go to uncover the truth? The room was dim, save for the flickering of the television that neither I nor my wife had turned off since yesterday. The news anchor's face, pale and impassive, mirrored my own hollow reflection in the window. They spoke of an ongoing investigation, no suspects, and a father desperate for answers. The words clung to the air like smoke, suffocating and acrid. I stood by the window, gripping the cold edge of the sill, staring at the swings in our backyard. They were still. Too still. My eyes caught the faint, smudged handprints on the glass, hers. Tiny, innocent prints. The kind I used to wipe away with a sigh when they obscured the morning sun. Now, I wished I'd never cleaned them. There was no clarity in my mind, no single thread to pull from the tangle of blame and regret. It was the playground, the school, the busybody neighbors who never noticed anything. It was my wife's insistence that children need space to explore. The teachers who could have been more vigilant. The very air for carrying the scent of something wrong that none of us noticed in time. And me. It was always, ultimately, me. I replayed the scene in my mind like a sick reel. Her backpack abandoned on the ground, straps twisted like arms thrown aside in protest. The stuffed rabbit she never went without lying face down in the dirt. I had brushed its fur too many times to mistake it for someone else's. Then there were the footprints. Small. Uncertain. Fading into the tree line at the edge of the park. Police marked them with tape, but I didn't need markers to tell me where they led. They led to nowhere. The house had always been too big. My wife loved its creaking charm, its potential, but now it felt cavernous, a void that swallowed any sound other than the ones I didn't want to hear. The faint hum of the refrigerator. The distant tick of a clock. And my breathing, heavy and uneven, reverberating off walls that no longer felt like home. Her room was untouched. The bed still unmade from that morning, covers crumpled into a heap as if she'd only just rolled out of them. I could almost hear her laughter, high and bright, like a bird's call as she dragged her doll along the wooden floor. But the silence that filled the room now was thick, oppressive. I noticed things I never had before. A chipped corner on her nightstand. A scuff mark on the wall where her chair had rubbed against it too many times. Little imperfections that suddenly felt like accusations. The photos on her dresser stared back at me. Smiling faces captured in moments I had barely noticed when they were happening. I scanned the room for something, anything, I might have missed. Something the police might have overlooked. My eyes fell on a drawing pinned to the corkboard above her desk. A crude outline of a man and a girl, the figures holding hands. The man's face was blank, just an oval, void of features. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Had she ever shown this to me? Was this new? Or had it been here for weeks, months, staring at me while I shuffled past with too many things on my mind? I wanted to scream, to tear the drawing from the wall, but my hand froze mid-reach. My throat clenched tight as I realized something else. The man in the drawing wasn't holding her hand. His fingers, thin and claw-like, were wrapped around her wrist. The drawing stayed with me. Even after I left her room, its shadow lingered, burned into my vision like an afterimage of a bright light. It wasn't just the eerie simplicity of it, the way the blank face seemed to stare no matter where you looked. It was the detail, the unnatural length of the fingers, the way they gripped her wrist so tightly it almost hurt to look at. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper in front of me, smoothing its edges over and over until they curled upward. My wife stood by the sink, her hands trembling as she rinsed a plate that didn't need rinsing. The faucet sputtered. For a moment, the noise almost drowned out the thoughts in my head. Almost. That drawing. Why hadn't I noticed it before? Was it new? A child's creation, drawn in haste, or something deeper, more deliberate? I reached for her notebooks, a stack of colored covers shoved into the corner of the table. Each page was a collision of childish scrawls and bright crayon colors. Pink houses. Green grass. Blue skies. But the further I flipped, the darker they became. Figures appeared more often. Shadowy shapes standing at the edges of playgrounds, behind trees, always just out of reach. A recurring figure, tall and featureless, loomed in several. In one, it stood next to a house I recognized as ours. And then the last page. It stopped me cold. The drawing was of her. The details were unmistakable: her yellow dress, her brown curls, her stuffed rabbit. But she wasn't standing. She was lying on the ground, her arms and legs sprawled unnaturally, her eyes replaced by empty circles. And next to her, drawn in black crayon so furiously the paper had nearly torn, was that same blank-faced figure. The plate slipped from my wife's hands, shattering on the floor. She gasped, her face pale as she turned toward me. "What is it?" she whispered, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't stop staring at the page. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw that drawing, those hollow circles where her eyes should have been, the heavy, black smears that shaped the figure beside her. I got out of bed and wandered the house, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. I found myself back in her room, the scent of her shampoo faint, but still lingering in the air. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale streaks on the walls. Something felt wrong. The room seemed colder than the rest of the house. My chest tightened as I stepped toward her dresser. The surface was cluttered with the small tokens of childhood: bracelets, a plastic tiara, a scattering of coins. But there, wedged between the jewelry box and a stuffed bear, was something I didn't recognize. It was a photograph. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was one of those cheap, instant pictures, slightly overexposed. It showed her standing in our backyard, the swing set behind her. She wasn't smiling, though. Her face was blank, her expression distant, almost dazed. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. There, in the background, almost imperceptible at first, was the shadow of a figure standing at the tree line. Tall, featureless, watching. I flipped the photo over, my fingers fumbling. Scrawled on the back in clumsy, childish letters was a single word: friend. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly shoved the photograph into my pocket. My mind raced with questions. When was this taken? How did it end up here? And why did she call it a friend? The house felt alive with shadows as I walked back to the kitchen. I didn't bother turning on the lights. The police had said something about strangers lurking, but this wasn't some random person. It couldn't be. I stood at the sink, staring out into the backyard. The swing set creaked in the wind, swaying gently. Beyond it, the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches gnarled and twisting in the dark. For a moment I thought I saw movement. A shape just beyond the tree line. Tall still, watching. My breath caught in my throat. But when I blinked, it was gone. The photograph consumed me. I spent the next day with it clutched in my hand, turning it over and over as though the faint shadow in the background might reveal something new if I stared hard enough. It didn't. But the word on the back, friend, gnawed at me. Her teacher had once mentioned imaginary friends. A phase, they called it. Something kids grow out of. But this wasn't a phase. This was something far darker. I scoured the house, tearing through her things, desperate for answers. I found more drawings buried in her desk, stuffed under her bed. The blank-faced figure was in almost all of them. Always watching. Always close. In one, it stood next to a swing set. In another, it loomed behind her as she walked to school. One drawing stood out. It showed the same figure, but this time, its hand stretched toward hers. She had drawn it with dark, heavy strokes, the crayon pressing so hard that the paper had crinkled. Beneath it, in her messy handwriting, was another word: safe. Safe? The thought made my stomach churn. I sat on the floor of her room, surrounded by the evidence of her fear, or worse, her trust. My head throbbed, a dull ache spreading behind my eyes. The air in the room felt heavier, oppressive, like I wasn't alone. The phone rang, sharp and shrill, breaking the silence. I scrambled to answer it. "Mr. Hendricks?" The detective's voice was calm but firm. "We've had a development. I need you to come down to the station." My heart leapt to my throat. Did you find her? There was a pause, too long for comfort. Please, just come in. There's something you should see. I drove in silence, the photograph burning a hole in my pocket. The road blurred under the weight of my thoughts. What had they found? Could it be her? The thought filled me with equal parts hope and dread. When I arrived, the detective met me in the lobby, his expression grim. He held a manila envelope in his hands. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow him. In the cold, sterile light of the interrogation room, he slid the envelope across the table. We found this near the park, he said, his voice low. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs. The first showed her, my little girl, sitting on the swings. She was smiling this time, though it didn't reach her eyes. She looked tired. Behind her, the same shadowy figure stood at the edge of the frame, its featureless face tilted slightly, almost like it was posing. I flipped through more pictures, each one worse than the last. She was never alone. The figure was always there, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always watching. The final photo made my blood run cold. It was her backpack, lying in the dirt, straps twisted like the ones I'd found at the park. But this time, there was something else in the frame. A note. Scrawled in childish handwriting, it read, "She's with me now. She's safe." I left the station with the envelope tucked under my arm, my mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The photos weighed heavy, their images burned into the back of my eyelids. That figure, always there, always watching, it wasn't just in her drawings. It had followed her into the real world, into her life. The detective had asked if I recognized the handwriting on the note. I didn't. It wasn't hers. The letters were messy, uneven, but deliberate. It wasn't the scrawl of a child lost in their imagination. It felt planned. I parked the car in the driveway and sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the house. Its windows glared back at me, hollow and accusing. My wife had called earlier, her voice brittle, begging me to come home, but I hadn't answered. I couldn't face her. Not yet. When I finally stepped inside, the house was silent. The kind of silence that clings, heavy and unnatural. The kind that reminds you of how alone you really are. I spread the photographs across the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I studied each one. Her face. That figure. The way it seemed to inch closer in every shot, just a step or two nearer, as if it was waiting for the right moment. What was it? Who was it? The police had called it a person of interest. But there was nothing human about that figure. No features. No expression. Just a void where a face should be. I reached for the drawing from her room, holding it side by side with one of the photographs. The similarities were undeniable. She'd seen it before. She knew it. That's when I noticed it, the background of one of the photos. A faint outline of something carved into a tree behind the figure. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. It was a symbol. A crude spiral, encircled by jagged lines, like a child's attempt at drawing the sun. I didn't recognize it, but it felt familiar, like something I'd seen in passing but never truly noticed. I had to go back. The park was dark by the time I arrived, the streetlights casting long, spindly shadows across the ground. The air was cold, sharp, biting at my skin as I stepped out of the car. I clutched a flashlight in one hand, the photograph in the other. I followed the path toward the playground, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the damp earth. The swing set creaked softly in the breeze, its chains rattling like a distant whisper. And then I saw it. The tree from the photograph. Its bark was rough and weathered, but the symbol was there, carved deep, its edges sharp and deliberate. My fingers traced it as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. Safe. The word from her drawings echoed in my mind, twisting into something cruel. Safe? Safe from what? Behind me, a branch snapped. I turned, my flashlight sweeping through the darkness, its beam trembling with the unsteadiness of my hand. The playground was empty, but the shadows seemed deeper, darker. Somewhere, just beyond the edge of the trees, I thought I saw movement. The air grew heavier with each passing second, pressing down on me like a weight. My flashlight flickered, its beam trembling as if it, too, was afraid of what it might reveal. I stood rooted to the spot, staring into the thick tangle of trees where I thought I'd seen something move. But there was nothing. Just darkness. The swing set groaned behind me, its chain swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. My throat tightened as I forced myself to turn back to the tree. The carved spiral glared at me, its jagged edges raw against the bark, like a wound that refused to heal. Why this tree? Why here? My mind raced as I circled it, scanning the ground for anything that might make sense of the symbol. That's when I noticed the earth at the base of the trunk. It was disturbed, a patch of soil darker and looser than the rest. I dropped to my knees, the flashlight clenched between my teeth as I dug into the dirt with bare hands. The cold soil clawed at my skin, filling the spaces beneath my nails. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I unearthed something hard, something smooth. It was a box. Small, metal, its surface rusted with age. My fingers trembled as I pried it loose, dirt crumbling from its edges. I set it on the ground and stared at it, my chest tight with a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. The lid resisted at first, as if the box itself didn't want to be opened. But with a sharp twist, it gave way. Inside was a photograph. My heart stopped as I pulled it out. It was of her, my little girl, her face smeared with dirt, her expression frozen somewhere between fear and confusion. She was standing by this very tree, the same spiral carved into the bark behind her. And she wasn't alone. That figure was there again, standing just behind her, its blank face tilted downward as though it were whispering in her ear. Its hand rested on her shoulder, long fingers draped over her like the legs of a spider. There was something else in the box. A second photograph. This one was older, the colors faded and worn. It showed another child, a boy this time, standing near the same tree. He couldn't have been older than 8. The figure was there too, farther in the background but unmistakable. And beneath the photo, etched into the bottom of the box, was another word, mine. A sound broke the stillness, a faint rustling, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. My head snapped up, the flashlight jerking toward the trees. This time, I wasn't imagining it. Something was moving, just beyond the edge of the light. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. My flashlight's beam quivered as I turned it toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. Branches shifted, snapping back into place like elastic, and for a moment, I swore I saw a shape, a tall, narrow silhouette that melted into the darkness as quickly as it appeared. The box slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever was hiding in the shadows, but my legs felt rooted to the earth. "Who's there?" I finally croaked, my voice hoarse and trembling. The words felt absurd, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. Another snap, closer this time. The flashlight flickered, its weak beam struggling against the consuming dark. I swept it across the tree line, my fingers numb against the cold metal. The spiral on the tree seemed to shimmer faintly in the pale light, almost alive. Then I saw it. The figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the edges of the light. It was tall, impossibly so, its body unnaturally thin, the featureless face tilting slightly as though studying me. Its hands hung at its sides, fingers impossibly long, twitching subtly like the legs of a dying insect. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the uneven ground, and fell hard onto my back. The flashlight rolled from my grasp, its beams spinning wildly before settling on the tree. The spiral carving seemed to pulse, its lines stark and jagged against the bark. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its very existence a black hole that seemed to pull the air from my lungs. Then, it raised an arm. The motion was slow, deliberate. It pointed toward the ground at the base of the tree, where the disturbed earth had revealed the box. I froze, my breath hitching as a wave of dread washed over me. The meaning was clear: dig. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing in. My hands moved on their own, clawing at the loose dirt, tearing deeper into the ground. The figure remained motionless, watching with that blank, featureless face. My fingers struck something hard. Wood. A small wooden box, the surface worn and cracked. My stomach churned as I dragged it free, setting it down on the ground. This box was older, its hinges rusted and brittle. I hesitated, glancing up at the figure. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to pulse, heavy and expectant. I lifted the lid. Inside was a child's shoe. Small. Yellow. My daughter's shoe. The shoe tumbled from my trembling hands, landing softly in the dirt. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unwilling to accept what I was seeing. It was hers. There was no mistaking it, the scuffed sole, the faded pink flower stitched into the side. The world around me seemed to tilt, my knees buckling under the weight of realization. My mind clung to denial, but my gut churned with the awful certainty, she had been here. The figure still loomed, silent and unmoving. Its arm lowered slowly, and for a brief moment, I thought it might step back into the shadows and vanish. But it didn't. Instead, it bent forward, folding unnaturally at the waist, its long fingers stretching toward the ground. It dragged its hand through the dirt, leaving behind shallow furrows that resembled the spiral carved into the tree. Then it straightened, pointing into the forest. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't ignore the silent command. My body moved of its own accord, pulled forward by some unseen force. The flashlight's beam barely illuminated the path ahead, but I could hear the figure's faint, deliberate footsteps behind me, keeping pace. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in, their branches clawing at the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. We came to a clearing, the moonlight spilling through the canopy like cold silver. In the center stood another tree, taller and older than the rest. Its bark was gnarled and dark, twisted into shapes that seemed almost human. The figure stepped past me, its movements slow and deliberate, and raised one long arm toward the tree. There, hanging from a low branch, was her backpack. It swayed gently in the breeze, its straps twisted just as I'd seen them before. My chest heaved as I stumbled forward, my hands reaching for it. The fabric was damp, heavy with the weight of something inside. I lowered it to the ground, my fingers fumbling with the zipper. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness, each inch revealing more of what lay within. At first, it was just dirt. Clumps of wet soil that smeared my hands. Then I saw it, something wrapped in faded cloth, stained and torn. My heart stopped as I peeled it back, revealing a small, pale hand. Her hand. My scream tore through the night, raw and broken, but it was swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. The figure loomed closer, its blank face tilting as though in sympathy, or mockery. I stumbled back, tears blinding me as I clutched at her lifeless hand, willing it to be a mistake, a nightmare I could wake from. But it wasn't. She was gone. And the figure had taken her. I knelt there, cradling her hand, unable to breathe, unable to think. My mind was a storm of rage and grief, swirling in a violent, endless loop. She was gone. My little girl, stolen and discarded like she meant nothing. I turned toward the figure, my vision blurred with tears, but it stood as still as ever, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if observing me with quiet curiosity. Its presence no longer felt distant or surreal. It felt personal. This wasn't random. "You did this," I choked out, my voice barely audible. My fists clenched, trembling with fury, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. The air around us seemed to thrum, heavy with something unspoken, something I couldn't begin to comprehend. The tree loomed above, its twisted branches casting shadows like skeletal fingers. At its base, her backpack lay open, the last remnants of her innocence spilling into the dirt. I reached for the flashlight, gripping it tightly as I stumbled to my feet. The beam flickered weakly, but I didn't care. I swung it wildly, aiming for the figure's head, its body, anything to make it hurt as much as I did. But the flashlight passed through it as though it were made of smoke. I staggered back, panting, as the figure remained unmoved, unbothered by my rage. Its hand rose once more, pointing to the base of the tree. The spiral. It was there again, not carved this time but formed from the gnarled roots, etched into the earth with unnerving precision. The edges pulsed faintly, as if alive, as if the earth itself were breathing. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, the weight of everything crushing me. I stared at the spiral, my mind a blur of fragmented thoughts. Was this where it had happened? Was this where she'd been taken, where she'd died? The figure moved closer, its presence cold and suffocating. It knelt before me, its featureless face inches from mine. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't the figure speaking. It was her. My daughter. Daddy, it's okay. My breath caught as the whisper faded, replaced by silence. The figure straightened, its blank face tilting one last time before it stepped back into the shadows. I lunged after it, screaming, but the darkness swallowed it whole. I was alone again, the clearing empty save for the tree, the spiral, and her remains. I collapsed beside her, my hands clawing at the dirt as I screamed into the night. I stayed there until dawn, the cold light of morning washing over the clearing. The figure didn't return. It didn't need to. It had already taken everything. The end.